Okay, panel 2 is looking at another big issue for the state. With all the new technologies and people wanting more choice, more flexibility, more affordable electricity, many are talking about leaving the grid. Is that something that's good for the customer, good for the utility, good for the state, good for the public interest? Let's explore with Dawn Lippert, the chair of the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, director of the Energy Accelerator, an organization that's promoting entrepreneurs in clean energy technologies. A warm welcome for Dawn Lippert.
All right, good afternoon. So I'd like to start off with a couple of numbers myself. As Kyle said, he really likes numbers. We come from the same management consulting background, so I think it's contagious. And I'm actually going to start off with a few numbers for this panel to kind of bridge from the last panel. And they're numbers that come from a recent survey that we did last month with WIRE, Women in Renewable Energy, which is a nonprofit that I'm on the board of. And I'd like to share some of the results from that. And before I do, I want to specifically call out the fact that this is a very specific audience of people. So they're people that are self-identified as 92% are informed about energy issues. So I think it's actually quite similar to this audience that we have here today. And this is not a scientific survey. It is not randomized. It went out to about 500 people on the list, and I think got somewhere just short of 100 responses around this. So there's 15 questions. They're on the WIRE website, but I want to highlight a few of the answers to the questions that came back. There's also some really good comments. We published all the results in full for everybody's benefit. One of the questions was, there were two sets of questions about whether people feel like they know what the plans are. So the first question was whether you feel like you know what the state's energy plan is, and the second question was whether you feel like you know what NextEra and HECO's energy plan is for the future. So the first question came back, both questions had about 6 or 7% said yes, they know what the plan is. So that's 6 or 7% for those two. And the rest of the people, which is around 93 or 94%, said it was either not clear or that only aspects of it were clear. So I thought that was interesting. But there's a big flip between NextEra and the State Energy Plan, where the State Energy Plan, 30% said it's not clear, and for NextEra and Hawaiian Electric, 60% said it was not clear. So about twice as many people thought that the utilities plan was not necessarily clear. And then the last question I want to share with you today, which I think is really important for this panel here, around customer choice in particular, is what do you think is the most important area for the state to dedicate resources to? And the top 3 things by far were, number 1 by far was PUC capacity, which is critical to the issue of customer choice. The second was innovation, and the third was energy efficiency in state facilities. And then coming in behind those 3, we had planning and analysis, workforce development, and state energy office capacity. So those are just a few numbers I wanted to share from that survey. Again, not representative, but I think that this goes to the question of what are people thinking, and hopefully we're going to see right after this panel what you folks think about customer choice and where that role is. The second set of numbers that I would like to briefly share with you is related to my role as the director of the Energy Accelerator. We're focused on innovation. We're really your innovation program. We're a nonprofit program that funds about 15 companies a year. And right now, in our office, we are going through due diligence on the companies that we're looking at this year. So we look at a couple hundred companies each year, and we select 15 for funding and for helping transform Hawaii's energy system. So companies that are really solving problems here. And every year, we see some really interesting trends in the numbers that are coming through. So this year, we saw about 15 companies in solar data, forecasting, quantification, everything around solar data. About 19 companies in transportation and handling the interface of transportation and electricity, which is something that many customers care about here. 23 companies around energy efficiency, innovative building management, demand response. And by far the largest category that we're looking at, and the ones that have kind of made it to our next round of companies that are really interesting, is over 35 companies doing grid battery interface, residential energy storage, behind the meter energy storage, and other kinds of customer energy storage around solar. So this is clearly an area where entrepreneurs and our innovation community are very active, and they're responding to what they see as a market need on the customer side. So there's some things I wanted to share with you folks. For us, this brings up a couple of really key questions in the innovation world, which are 3 particular questions. The first is, how, and these are things I'm asking our panelists to consider as well in their comments, which are, the first is around how regulation can proceed alongside deployment on the customer side of the meter. There's a lot of action right now on the customer side of the meter, and yet a lot of action also on the regulatory side. So how are those things proceeding in parallel or sometimes at loggerheads? The second question is how we can evaluate innovation in some of these new options that are coming along with new technology in particular, and not pilot things to death. How do we define the success for some of these customer-sited solutions, and then what's the path to scaling them? And the third question that I'm going to ask you folks to consider around this idea of customer choice as we sort of enter a new paradigm there is how we organize and aggregate distributed systems to provide the most value to our overall energy system as well as to end user customers. So those are three things that I'm hoping that we really dig into in this panel, and I, for one, am very excited to hear what our panelists have to say. So without further ado, I would like to welcome David Bissell as our kickoff here at the Customer Choice panel.
Thank you and good afternoon. Before I start on my presentation, I want to say that to frame this discussion in terms of extremes on or off the grid isn't realistic or especially helpful in exploring the consumer choice question, start off picking on the panel topic. It also makes it difficult to have a rational conversation about the relationship between distributed generation and the utility. I think the conversation has evolved past either of those extremes. We've all seen that rooftop solar and battery storage can help Hawaii reduce its oil dependency, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and reduce the amount we pay for energy. But without the grid, none of this is going to work very well. Yes, you could go off grid, but why would you want to? It's not very efficient to go off the grid. It wastes billions of dollars that have already been invested in a network that delivers electricity to every household that wants it and provides the frequency support that is essential to expanding renewable energy here in Hawaii. You can't get to the goal of 100% renewable without a smart, robust grid. And so to be talking about going off grid and to encourage people to be aspiring to that, I think that simply distracts us from getting to some of the more difficult issues that we need to resolve. Tesla's Elon Musk summarized the issue well by saying that going off grid is, quote, not the most rational approach in most cases. I say I agree with that as well, and really for three reasons: cost, convenience, and efficiency. First, I'd like to talk about cost. We as a state should want to invest our money either through individual investment or state-based incentives in a manner that produces the greatest return, which in many, if not most cases, is utility scale. Large-scale PV and batteries are unquestionably less expensive than small home-based systems. For example, utility-scale PV is about half the cost of rooftop-based PV. Battery storage is also considerably cheaper. We already have the grid infrastructure in place, so why not utilize the least expensive option? KIUC, we're committed to lowering our rates long-term through renewables, efficiency, and lower-priced supplemental fossil fuel, likely LNG. We do not believe that higher prices are inevitable and that you need to, quote, escape the grid to lower your electric bill. I believe we need to implement solutions that result in the lowest cost energy for all, not just for those who can afford it. Without even going into the life cycle costs such as maintenance, disposal, etc., going off the grid is likely not going to be feasible for many of Hawaii's families. I'm absolutely convinced that having everyone go off grid through self-generation and storage will not be the best answer for Hawaii, even if distributed storage costs drop radically. Why? Because to maintain living standards and convenience that most of us want, we would need to way overbuild PV and storage to provide the ability to use as much power as we want, when we want. The grid is there 24/7, and you don't have to deal with the maintenance issues and hassles associated with operating your own system. Personally, I don't like having to even mow my own lawn. I certainly don't want to have to maintain an electrical system in my house and be responsible for all that hassle. Ultimately, even those who want to generate their own electricity and go through that problem, a grid is still a cheap backup resource for them. The grid is also extremely efficient. The grid evens out system supply and system demand amongst a wide variety, thousands of fact users and generation resources. This results in much lower overall peak demand to build for and invest in, and ultimately lowers overall costs. Think about it, if all users are off grid, they all have to design a system built for their peak needs. All of these are going to pancake together, and it's going to be an incredible waste of resources and capital investments in the state rather than balancing them out amongst all of us. This would be tremendously costly and inefficient. Talk briefly about 100% renewable. To reach 100% renewable in a cost-effective manner, we're going to need to utilize many different resources, including hydropower, wind, biomass, biodiesel, geothermal, and potentially wave or tidal-based energy. Most of these technologies only work on a grid. They're too large scale to be done on rooftops or on a home ownership. You have to have a grid to capitalize on everybody being part of it. Also, higher renewable penetration will require more precise balancing of load and demand, and a smart, robust grid will be essential. I'd like to conclude by quoting Solar City's Lyndon Rive. To go off grid is not a good design. That's an outcome of bad policy. And with that, I thank you.
All right, fabulous, thanks. So now we're gonna next bring up Ben Sullivan, or Chris, are you next?
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
Chris is gonna take us away, and we'll finish off with Ben. Welcome, Chris.
Got it. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris DeBone, president of the Hawaii Solar Energy Association, HCED in Hawaii. And the topic of this and what I was tasked to do is talk about going off-grid in 2015. What's available, what's out there, and what to expect, which is more important. We will have a further discussion on should we go off-grid, should we stay on-grid, what's the policy going to dictate, but let's go through some and just talk about what is available today and some things you need to consider to do that, because that is a topic that's out there in the community. We all saw it in the newspaper in the last couple of days. Hank Rogers did a very large publicity. It's been out there, so it's something that we have to talk about. You have to first ask yourself, what were off-grid systems originally intended for? And where were they used? They're originally intended for remote locations that could not connect to a utility, had no utility, or the cost justification to bring utility there was prohibitive, so you would have a technology to be able to do so. People talk about this being a very large new technology. Off-grid systems have been available for 30 years. Typically the battery technology has changed, but they've been available and out there. You look at Big Island, there's a significant amount of people on the Big Island in remote locations completely off-grid because of the remoteness of the location. Well, the next question we have to ask, what off-grid systems are now becoming? Now it's becoming a customer choice. Not in the first scenario, but right in the middle of a densely populated circuit right in Honolulu, where the first one doesn't apply, but now there's an option for the consumer to be able to go off-grid. And consumers, it's sexy to them. People think it's neat, it's techy to be able to do that. What off-grid systems have the potential to become is another competition to the existing business model. And that's what it could be. And it's everyone in this room to talk about, do we want that to go to that? Will it be competition, or will it be beneficial to the utility for all ratepayers? What to expect when considering going off-grid, and we hear this from a lot of customers a lot of the time, and currently going off-grid is a lifestyle. Shifting inappropriate loads. To have an off-grid PV system to cook a turkey in an oven takes a lot of electricity and a lot of power. Consumption and power. So you have to size this system to a very unique device inside your home, so typically you'd have to switch these to other types and means which is not as convenient for some people. Number two, reduce waste through energy efficiency. Because of the cost, it's cost prohibitive to get then all LEDs and get your home as efficient as possible to use as much and reduce. There's restrictions that apply. So use energy in proportion to the amount that's available. You are restricted to use the amount that you have stored. You have lost now that the grid that's always there for backup. The Super Bowl scenario, we talk to customers a lot. They think that they want to go off grid, and we look at the value propositions, and I always bring up the Super Bowl. So you've sized the system, you look at your electric bill, you think you have enough power until you have your friends and family over, and that one day a year, you start turning on your AC, you turn on the 3 TVs instead of 1, halfway through the Super Bowl, you're out of juice. Because you didn't plan for that one day a year that the day before it was maybe cloudy. And these are things that people really have to think about. And electric vehicles take a lot of power. It's going to be very interesting to be able to capture that much power. The fifth one, range anxiety. A lot of people have heard about it in electric vehicles. You had to get society over that. Man, I don't know how long this is going to take, and I can't just pull over. I have to plug in and wait. So imagine range anxiety within your daily life of knowing how much power do you have. To sum it all up, manage your solar, or it will manage you. And this is just what to expect of being able to go off-grid. This is what a historic off-grid system would look like. A lot of techies do it, right? I'm just going to go get some lead-acid batteries down at the store, get some old golf cart batteries, wire it up and put it in. Well, we all know this is becoming a pretty famous picture. This is in our backyard, completely off-grid system in our backyard in Honolulu with new technology, safer technology, and cleaner looking installs. It's available today if chosen to be used. To go through this, I think it put them all into one slide. It was supposed to step through. But some things to consider on the battery technology is broken down into 4 quadrants. Environmental impact. That's very important to know what type of batteries and storage will you have. Is it lead acid? Is it lithium ion phosphate? All these different technologies, and what does it do to the environment? What did it take to get them out? And what is it going to do when you have to recycle them at the end of life in Hawaii? Number 2, the physical size and performance of it. So how much room do you have? How much energy do you need? And how much space is available to be able to do that? Is it going to take up part of your garage? Is it going to fit in a closet in a room? The cost per kilowatt hour of that storage, is it cost prohibitive? Some are cheaper, but they don't last as long. You get a very expensive battery and it might last longer. You have to look at that value proposition. And number 4, the total life cycle. How long is it going to last versus the cost to put that together? The sweet spot of the perfect battery would be right in the middle. If you look at battery technology today, you're going to see some gain in 1, 2, or 3 of those areas, but to get that in the center, that we have environmentally safe, cost effective, long life and small, that's where we do that. And the discussion will be with this technology, knowing it's there, knowing it's been around, do we choose to go off grid or not? We talked about it earlier. There's a policy, how long policy is going to take to get the adoption versus the technology that's going to allow the choice. Which one comes first? And one has to stay ahead of or up with the other. Thank you. The contact information, I'm stepping in for Leslie Cole-Brooks, the executive director. So any questions, go through her and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, that gives us a sense of kind of what's available, and we'll get into what should and shouldn't happen next. And now I'm going to welcome up Ben Sullivan, who's the County Energy Coordinator for Kauai, to take us home.
to get there? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to Hawaii Energy Policy Forum for letting me take a crack at this very challenging problem and this very challenging question, and for organizing a great event. Really, really appreciate it. As someone who lives on one of the outer islands, I always value the opportunities we get to really come in and connect with what's happening. And I think it's also helpful sometimes to get the outside perspective, because we're not here every day with you guys kind of grinding it out. So what I'm going to try to do is give you the perspective of a large customer of KIUC in this case, and also of a government entity as it relates to this question. I will say as a lead is that I agree with a lot of what David said initially, but I didn't interpret the title of the panel so deliberately. I guess I saw it more as those were the bookends, and we're talking about our changing relationship to the grid. So that's what I'm going to try to dive into. So why am I showing you a picture of a wastewater plant? I'll get to that in a minute. I want you to notice that I'm trying to influence you guys here. You're going to get asked some questions in a little bit from Meeting Sift, and I'm giving you a little pre-look at them. There's a couple things I'd like you to do. One is start looking at these questions and put why in front of the question. So we're looking at, for your home or business, have you considered leaving the grid? The first thing you got to do is ask why. We looked at this wastewater plant a few years ago, and we had the help of some very highly qualified consultants and actually contractor, and we actually got as far as pricing it and almost ready to do it. What we did is we designed a 1 megawatt plus PV array and a very large battery, and we were very serious about moving it effectively off the grid. I'll get to the details of that in a minute, but what we found is that with high oil prices, with tax credits, with government grants, with everything we could throw at it, it was still more expensive. And on top of being more expensive, it was prohibitive from the standpoint of new risks that the county was completely unfamiliar with, new operational obligations, and at the end of the day, it wasn't off the grid. It was a system that was going to provide 90% of our energy, but require the grid both to feed in surplus and to take energy when we needed it. So this is the only time we've had a real serious look at it. We decided it wasn't the best thing for us or for the island. Something else I'll say real briefly, the County of Kauai does not have a lot of PV on its own facilities. We got about 200 kW of PV. We've learned a little bit from the systems we put in, but fairly early on we made a decision that we have a cooperative on Kauai, and effectively they're the best at putting photovoltaics in on the island, and they can do it the cheapest, as David said. We really agree with that, and our view is that, that economically there's not a win there. The other thing that we've thought of, and I know there's some people out there saying, hey, it's not just economics, but even from an environmental perspective, we want to lead, we want to be out there getting the right thing done, but we feel that KUC has shown through their actions that they are going to maximize the amount of PV we can get on the grid. They're committed to doing so. So if we put in another 800 kW of PV on the grid, really all that does is it just means 800 kW is just not going to go in somewhere else. So we have taken a very different approach than I think some other places with that in mind, and I think a lot of that is a function of the co-op, but also a function of how these guys have gotten out in front of it. So there it is, community solar. This is actually KUC's Kaloa Solar Project, 12 megawatts, and we all own a piece of it, albeit a very small piece. It's not exactly what I think was intended with the legislature when they talked about community solar, but it is very much that. I would argue actually it's even more equitable than the community solar model we have now, in that it's not exclusive. Everybody on Kauai gets a piece of this and gets a benefit from it. So these are some tough questions. Should the state continue tax credits for rooftop solar? And should the state give tax credits for battery storage? These are questions you guys are going to get meeting sifted on later. Really tough answers, but I think, again, you got to start with why. Why should we continue the tax credit, and why should we give battery storage tax credits? I don't say that to be provocative, and I don't say it implying that we shouldn't. But I think that we have to remember, in all the engineering and all the wonkiness and all that we're solving this problem and that's a problem, what are we trying to achieve is so essential. And I think this has been mentioned in previous panels. We really need to stay on top of this. So a few thoughts on continuing tax credits. Obviously, we all know when the tax credits were first implemented, it was a means of facilitating an action in the market that perhaps wouldn't have happened otherwise. It was a means of stimulating the industry, growing something that wasn't there. I think we can all recognize that has changed very much. And today, one could argue that, one of the things that happens as a function of the tax credits is that we give people a faster return on their investment and a larger return on their investment. So it's very different today, and I think we need to think about that. I'm not proposing that we should just pull the rug out, but I'm proposing that there's a different conversation. I will mention, a lot of you may be familiar, but I was looking up in preparation for this, NYSERDA has a tiered declining schedule for credits in the New York area that they provide as an incentive for PV installation. And so they have defined quantities of PV, they have blocks. Once that block is achieved, they actually give a lesser credit, and they go down and down and down. And they actually manage that in real time. So you can go onto their website and you can see exactly where they are, and you can know as a consumer, this is the state of things, and I think it's very understandable as to why they do that. So perhaps something we could look to and learn from somewhere else. Obviously, we're wrestling with these issues very vigorously right now. As far as battery tax credits, this is a tough one. I really don't have the experience to talk a lot about it, but I do think we should learn from what we've seen in solar tax credits. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, if we're going to incentivize this as a community, as a state, we have to ask the question, how do we deliver that value to everyone? And I think to everyone is the key question. It's everyone's money going into it. It should be everyone's return coming out. And to me, that implies, at least in the early going, that we look at creating more resilience, and we look at, one of the potential opportunities for storage is incentivizing storage in locations that really will help everybody. So it will help the utility, but potentially looking at critical services, facilities that need more resilient power, and getting them there, whether it's fire stations, police stations, hospitals, all those kind of things. That's one way to create a win-win. I personally get very uncomfortable with a storage tax credit that goes to someone who's got a lot of means and already a large PV system, and really all they're doing is trying to reduce the amount of electricity they buy from the grid. However altruistic their motives may be, it doesn't really share the benefit. This is another question you'll see. What is most important for customers to have choice in electricity use? And I would contend that technology, specifically information systems that provide timely and transparent cost and energy usage information and enable consumers to act on it. This is essential, and this is the most valuable thing we can give to people. I think this is well recognized, and we're moving in this direction. I can't say enough about it. This is actually a picture of the product that KAUC provides to us. I get a huge amount of value out of this. We're able to download all of our energy history from every meter we have within the county, look at it in up to 15-minute intervals, analyze it, deliver results from it. Really, really important. The piece that I think is a lot further behind, and there's been some discussion on, but it has not evolved yet, is how do we set up the mechanisms to make it actionable? So the data is there, but the rates are still really just avoided cost rates. There's not a lot we can do, and so all the commentary about time of use is obviously just right on the mark. So I covered this a little earlier. I'm gonna skip over this, but obviously, some of the critical services locations we could put storage that potentially might be of benefit both to the grid and to the facilities where they're sited, such as wastewater plants, fire stations, airports, and other things. Okay, so this is where the action is really happening. A lot of you in this room are way, way, way into this. I will say that I waded in as much as I could and read, several hundred pages of documents, but I think that's about 5% of what exists in this docket. So I want to say great work, keep it up, and I'm glad I'm not in there in the trenches with you. I was particularly pleased with DBET's final position recently submitted for the reason that it was concise. It was 26 pages, so was able to get through it quickly, and they had some good points. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So I guess I'll head up here so I can see our screen. I'd like to kick it off if you folks can start submitting questions. The code is Energy2. We look forward to seeing your questions. I'm going to kick it off and challenge you folks a little bit, because I want to get to a couple of pieces I think are important around this discussion. To start off, you talked a little about the storage tax credit, and I want to challenge you, Ben, a little bit on this, and also hear from the other panelists on this. So the purpose of tax credits, I think, is to get early market going, and I'm wondering how you folks view whether the benefit has to be shared in the early part of this market. So that's kind of the first part of my question around around the tax credits. This is a question that you folks will be asked for your opinion on in just a few minutes. And then part two of that question is there value from the customer side in seeing customers put their own capital to work for these new technologies and having customers take some of the risk as opposed to having utilities take all of that risk or take that first mover position for some of these new technologies? So I think those two are linked, but I'm going to challenge you on where that is for tax credits. Any thoughts? All three of you?
Okay, I guess I'm the one that opened the can of worms, so I'll try to reply. You know, I think obviously in the early going, you can probably be a little more liberal with the application of the tax credits if your objective is to try to stimulate the industry, and so that becomes the societal benefit. And in that case, perhaps you can do it. I think the lesson learned that is just really key is that you can't just set it based on a date several years out, and you have to understand that tax credits are dangerous things. You got to say, hey, let's tier it. Let's talk about defined boundaries. We're gonna give this much credit for up to this quantity of storage put in, and then we're going to reduce it, as opposed to saying the next 3 years it's a free for all. You know, those are the kind of problems we have. But I do wince a lot about, you know, personally as a co-op member and a ratepayer, about the idea of someone else just kind of getting huge benefit and really taking a lot of revenue away from what is supposed to be a shared system via public money.
Yeah. Anything from Chris or David?
I'll shift back to your second question about technology and risk. From a small utility standpoint, there's a great benefit in the homeowners and the small businesses absorbing that risk. We're simply not going to take flyers on new technology. It's got to be large enough. It's got to be commercial. You got to be able to take a loan out on it in order for a utility to do it. So there isn't. It's not going to. Some of the bigger utilities have research labs and will invest in that, but a small one is not going to. So there's benefit to us in that.
Yeah, some perspective on that. We're talking about tax credits and incentivizing technology and what is it going to benefit everybody. And just incentivizing storage to put it in, it's important to look at its intended use and how it's going to benefit everybody. Agreed. And if you look at it, it could be broken down into a tax credit as an incentive, but also if it's a benefit to all the ratepayers, the utility could look at it from a rebate standpoint. If in fact the storage is used for a benefit of the grid, is it serving a purpose versus just maybe defecting load? If it's serving a purpose, there has to be some fair compensation for that if in fact it starts to become an extension of the grid. DER 2.0, DG 2.0 is going to take a couple years. What happens in the meantime to be able to incentivize people to do it in a way that's going to benefit everybody?
Okay, great question. I think that's really critical. Let's see what our audience thinks about some of these questions now that they've come in. If rooftop PV is so much more expensive, why do we continue to subsidize it with tax credits and cost transfer to non-PV customers? Well, you're going to have an opportunity to weigh in on your opinion on this. Do you guys have any quick comments on this one? I don't think this panel necessarily thinks we should continue to subsidize it, the exception maybe of Chris. I don't know.
Well,
what are your thoughts
absolutely. On this? Yeah. Yeah. No, rooftop solar, you have to look at the high cost of energy in Hawaii. Especially right now, there's an 2016, the federal tax credit's going away. The amount that's been put in has benefited Hawaii as reduced, we quantified it and reduced oil brought into the state. Yeah, solar absolutely does, and as it continues to be beneficial to everybody.
You know, real briefly, I'll say the utility's got to show that it's going to maximize the PV on the grid in order for you to have confidence to pull back on rooftop solar. David did that actually, I think, and KUC did that really well. And one of the things they did actually that was, I think, really reflective of that philosophy is they said, we'll pay you the same thing. So, you know, right around the time they were paying a certain amount for solar, they came out and said, we'll pay our customers a similar amount. And that really spoke to the fact that, hey, everybody's in, but it's got to be competitive. We can't pay you more and then take that from someone else's pocket.
On the subject of PV, and particularly rooftop PV, it's important that everybody understands, and it's fairly obvious, but I think it gets lost a lot in the discussion, is PV only produces 20% of the time. PV is not the answer to our state's energy problem. It's a piece of the pie, and with that piece of the pie, and we're seeing it on Kauai where we're going to have 80% penetration soon, within another month, it also has problems. It limits the amount of other generation resources you can bring on. When your load is getting so low for 4 or 5 hours of the day, you can't bring on any processes that require a stable load for the amount of time. We can't bring in any more biomass plants. We can't bring anything that requires we must take load. So that 20% of the time is good, but that 20% of the time also hurts the other 80% of the time and takes options off the table to serve that other 80% of the time. So there's a lot of issues when you get to the high penetration side of this, and with any kind of policy, you should always look to where's the ultimate end game on this, and I think you're starting to see it on Kauai.
With the other cost of living in Hawaii, is off the grid a realistic option for the majority of consumers? So what are we seeing right now in terms of cost of going off the grid? Obviously, you know, Rocky Mountain Institute published a grid defection report that says Hawaii is going to be the first place in the U.S., and it's this year, next 2 years. Is this a realistic proposition for most customers here?
If we have a lot of interest in it, in the industry, the solar installers typically get a lot of interest in it. How many of those actually pull the trigger is not as much as everyone thinks. Everyone is very excited about it, the opportunity of it, but the value proposition right now is very difficult to properly size it. But it's moving fast, and I think there's an urgency of figuring out where do you want these to go, and do we want that to happen when that value proposition flips over? It's probably going to flip over quicker than we think. What are we going to do with that?
And my question for you folks, in terms of especially David, is there a role for the utility as some of these technologies take off for customer-sited energy storage, managing customer-sited resources? Is that something that you folks are looking into?
Yeah, and I'll speak from our particular utility, and I think I'd speak for any utility. The ability to go off grid, and particularly in Hawaii where the prices are high, it has changed our outlook. It's changed my outlook and my staff. We no longer look that we can raise rates and pass them on. It's not you have to look, what are the alternative technologies, what is the price to beat, and we have to control our costs. We have to be very competitive, or it will happen. Ultimately, it's all price, all cost. And if the utilities can't put a competitive product out there that's better, and there's a heck of a lot of advantages and reasons why the utility should be able to do that, as I talked about scale and the fact we're already connected to all the houses, well, then it's going to happen. And for it to happen, there'd have to be some, in my opinion, to move it from where the utility has the scale advantage to where smaller items have the scale advantage. It'd have to be a radical technology change, and if that does happen, I think the utilities would certainly be monitoring that and would be participating in that. So, yes.
All right, next question. Could distributed storage jointly developed with customer be a viable model for the utility? So we just talked about that, and I guess we can push into this one a little bit more. I think that there are a number of business models here. I know I see a lot of them come across our office, and we're funding 1 or 2 companies specifically in this area of companies that are looking to do distributed storage on the customer site, use customer capital to do that, in some cases no money down models, and then use that to tie back into the utility. What are the opportunities and drawbacks for that technology?
I mean, from a utility side, again, it's cost, and it's also the ability of the balance sheet, how much a utility can finance. A utility does not have unlimited ability to invest in a grid, so offloading some of that investment to distributed storage, I think there is a role for that, but it's got to be cost competitive. A utility will find a way to invest if it is cheaper than doing it at the smaller scale. So if price parity comes, absolutely. And there's advantages to where it sits on the grid as opposed to centralized from a transmission side. If it can be spread around, that has certain advantages, but ultimately it all comes down to end cost and what's best for the consumers.
Anything else to add?
There's competition on both sides. So solar and storage has to compete with regular generation, and regular generation has to compete with solar plus storage. Looking at it as a blended effect, looking at it from an extension of the grid, it gives customers customer choice to be able to generate their own electricity, use battery storage. And if you look at it just from a battery backup perspective, just for resiliency, you need a lot less storage as a consumer, and it's a lot more affordable. More people will do it, interconnected to the grid, and aggregated together. They can be a true extension of the grid under a controlled format to be able to be used when it's not in an emergency backup. If you look at both sides, that's kind of in the middle, and technology is going to allow that, and the value propositions for both sides get much better.
So what needs to happen on the policy side to make sure that that's in a controlled format? I guess my question is around, there aren't necessarily programs right now that the customers are enrolling in on storage, so it's kind of a free-for-all out there in terms of what people are putting on their houses on the grid. There's not necessarily a guarantee that that'll be tied back to provide centralized benefit. And what do you folks think needs to happen in order for that to become a reality?
The solar industry, just like the utility, has to make sure that they're safe and reliable because they're becoming part of the utility. So the solar industry has to figure out how do they interact, develop products that become an extension of the grid that is under the same guiding principles of the Public Utility Commission: affordable, reliable, and safe.
Do you think it can be done with industry alone without policy to make sure that those things are connected?
Not being interconnected. That's where policy comes in. So there's the safety, and I think reliability is what's happening right now in the dockets of how do you interconnect them and make sure that they're safe so that there is a win-win on both sides.
And then I'll say it came up in the first panel today in the poll, the number one issue, I'll say it's rates in the Public Utility Commission. We have a rate structure in Hawaii that's been around since the monarchy practically. It's old, it's outdated, it simply is not in line with the current environment we're in. We have to have, from a policy side, we have to have rates that reflect reality of cost. As a utility, we can't cost our product and put out the competitive side of a product, our good parts, because our rates are broken. Somebody can put in a hotel can put in a cogen facility, be substantially off-grid all the time of the year except for one time when they want full grid reliability, and they pay virtually nothing for it. We have to get our rates where they're costed out, where the values of the utility are there, and people and residences and businesses pay for that value. And can also, it helps everybody, I believe, because they can choose what's the most value. If it's cheaper to put PV in for variable energy during the time of the day, then the utility can get that society should have that. That's the right answer. But if it's not, it shouldn't be because of bad rate making that they're making that investment. So I firmly believe rates are the biggest problem in the state.
Yeah, and unbundled rates right now, it's combined into one rate structure. And if you get compensated for the ability that your device, being renewable or whatever, can serve, and you get fairly compensated for the value that it brings to everybody, that now you're starting to get compensated for it because it's bringing value to the grid. Consumers could be fairly compensated for not just export, but the value that they're bringing to the grid. And rate design is very, very key to that.
Right. Let's go on to our last question. Is there a safe way to store alternative energy such as solar and wind in mass amounts on the grid? It's very dangerous, I heard from Ben.
No, I mean, there's
Tax credit.
conventional technology right now is battery energy storage systems can do it safely, albeit fairly expensively. On Kauai, we're looking at pump storage hydro. That's got potential to use water and natural terrain to store it. Again, the economics are challenging on that as well. So safely, yes. Economically, well, maybe not.
So I think the other thing that, this question presumes that it's going to be something resolved centrally and with the utility. And I think the biggest untapped resource we have is customers, and we all know it. And it's contingent on getting meaningful information systems in place. And so, it seems like that's our mission. I mean, yesterday we need those smart meters. You guys know it. You guys want them. Everybody wants them. Let's make it happen. KUC's got them. Yesterday we need time of use rates, but we don't just need a rigid time of use rate. We need to figure out what's going to work. Maybe it's dynamic pricing. There's 100 different ways to go about this, but we got to start learning what it is. And it involves allowing customer interaction.
Because you opened that up, I'm curious what your feeling is around the role of demand response. I mean, for KIUC, this has been a question I think that's come up a number of times. Is there a role for demand response in helping provide mitigation for solar, wind, and other variable resources?
Yeah, there's definitely a role. We're doing a time of use pilot program we just filed with the PUC a couple of weeks ago, where we're going to be providing money for the participants to hook up their water heaters to timers to try to shift when the water heater's charged to move load to the daytime when the cheap solar can take advantage of it. Time has another big factor, and I'd be remiss not to bring it up. Speed to action, speed to move is a huge problem as well. A couple of guys I quoted, Solar City and Elon Musk from Tesla, these guys move where a year is forever to them. They move now, they move fast, they have the ability to put products out fast. You have the ability to see products out fast. We as the utility and we as the state don't have that ability. We want to do a pilot program on rates. We got to file with the PUC. We got to wait months for it to be approved. We got to wait a year for it to work its way out. We can't just say, hey, let's try this. It's relatively low risk. We'll take a little flyer on it and see how the market responds. I think we need to move towards that direction in a thoughtful and a cautious manner, but we have to have more flexibility to experiment to bring the greatest results.
And we're constantly asking them to do those kind of things too. So appreciate the support.
What's the barrier to that flexibility? Is it the regulatory process, or is it the sort of utility structure?
Yeah, it's the embedded regulatory process. It's the lack of resources for the regulators. We could have a whole day-long session on the issues around that process. It's very complex. There's good people in the PUC, there's good people in the Consumer Advocate's office. They're smart, they want to do it, but they got limited resources. What they're required to do is problematic. They don't have the ability to take a relatively small matter and say, hey, this is easy, we can desk stamp this and move it on. They got to go through a whole complicated, expensive process, really, with no materiality built into it. So it's a long process. There's no simple answer to it. I just know we need to do better.
Okay, great. So there's many more questions that we did not have a chance to get to, but now we want to ask you some questions to see if our panel was able to sway your thinking and kind of see where our audience is at on this. So the first question that we're asking here is, for your home or your business, have you considered leaving the utility grid? You never thought about it, considered it but not seriously, you're currently considering it, you plan to leave the grid, or you already left the grid. So it looks like the vast majority of folks are in the camp of never having really considered this or not seriously considered it. So I think this goes back to your folks' point about this.
We were pretty serious, but there's not an answer option for us about that. We considered it seriously and we decided not to do it.
Considered and dismissed. Option 6. All right, great. So our results here is basically evenly split between never thought about it and considered it but not seriously. And the rest is really a minority in terms of people considering this, which I think reflects kind of the economics of where we are and much of the discussion that we had today. Our next question: when community solar is here, will you participate? And again, community solar is the option to participate in a large-scale solar project as basically an investor or owner of that project and benefit from the tax credits and the revenue from that project. So it looks like we have evenly split between yes and no, and some folks that are not sure and don't know, which we may aggregate for the case of this survey. So it looks like we have a number of folks that are not sure or don't know. So I think in my mind that points partly to a need for education around what this would mean and whether it applies to you. So our answer is dominated by yes, and we'll see how this uptake happens as community solar goes through the process and is adopted this year. Our next question is, should the state continue tax credits for rooftop solar? A very active debate in many publications as well as discussion forums. We have yes, no, not sure, and don't know as our options here. So we have two options for you not to commit. Otherwise, you're going to have to make a choice, yes or no. So this is a pretty binary one, but as Ben pointed out, it's pretty complicated. But the majority of you, or just about half of you, say, no, we should not continue tax credits for solar. All right, and our next question is the same, but around battery storage. So a newer technology we had some discussion around today. Should the state give tax credits for battery storage? This is currently not something that we have. So no, most folks think that we should not have tax credits for battery storage, or at least 42% of you think that. With about a third of you saying yes, we should have tax credits for energy storage. So it'll be interesting to see how this one plays out in the next couple of legislative sessions. We have two more questions. The next one is around giving customers choice. What is most important for giving customers the most choice in their electricity use? Technology that provides energy usage information. I'm reading a more kind of full description of the answers here. So A is technology that provides energy usage information. Policy that supports community programs. C is tax credits. D is cost of renewables. And E is cheaper storage equipment. So what is the most important for giving customers the most choice in their electricity use? And it looks like many of you are a lot of different ideas here. Many of you are echoing what Ben said around technology that provides energy usage information. You can't change what you can't measure. Can't manage what you can't measure. So but our most popular answer here is policy. So that's the most important for giving customers the most choice in their energy use. And following that, we have the cost of renewables and technology that gives energy usage information. All right, our final question. All right, where should electricity be stored? So if energy storage is available, what should the location be? Should it be at the utility, in the community, or at the customer's house or business, or at the place where it is generated? So this is kind of a, which side of the fence, where are we putting energy storage? Our least popular answer is actually at customer site, so at the customer's homes and businesses. Only 16% of you think that it should be at the customer site. So I think this is reflecting some of the discussion today around how do we aggregate benefits from energy storage across many users. So thank you very much for your input. We're going to have just a minute or so from any closing remarks or burning points from any of our panelists they want to share. Then we'll take a break. So anything, let's start. We'll start actually. Chris, do you want to start at the end here with your any closing thoughts?
Sure, thanks. I guess in closing remarks, it's technology being adopted, the speed of technology going versus policy and how fast policy can keep up or being in front of technology. And Kyle on the last board brought up trust, and I think that's another important thing in discussions and dockets of all the relevant stakeholders. What's been missing, and it's you kind of see some deep divides that have been going on for years and years and years in Hawaii, and if we can't trust each other and we're on the world stage and really collaborate, how are we going to move forward? It's just going to be another test and see what happened. Just in that last panel, that word trust kind of resonated with me. For us to get past some, we need to collaborate. And when you get in it, there's just a story to talk about that. The last one of these DER docket meetings I attended, I made a statement as I looked around the room talking about the future of the solar industry, and noticed that I was the only one in the room that was actually a solar installer amongst all the people in the room making policy and where it's going to go for our industry. And yeah, we definitely need to kind of figure out how to change that to get more people with the right experience to make decisions on these.
Okay, Stan, I got 1 minute. You can't come after me for 1 minute. Has anyone seen the Future Grid Forum work that came out of Australia in the last year or so? One of the things that struck me, if you get a chance to Google it, it's pretty interesting. You know, Australia has a lot of similarities actually to Hawaii in that they have high rates, very high rates, relative to the rest of the world. They have a lot of adaptation of solar that is actually precipitated by archaic rate structures. They have a lot of things going on that actually have a lot of similarity. But one of the things that really struck me about their analysis is they recognize that they don't get to dictate the future vision. They can only influence it. And so they talked about what things are influencing them. And they talked about scenarios. Hey, we might end up with this, that, or the other kind of future. And given that, how do we want to influence it? And I think that's what we have to do. You know, we have to really think, and the PUC has done a lot, I think, with, you know, the inclinations and kind of driving things and saying, hey, it's going to be distributed. We know it's going to be 100% renewable. But you know, what's the mix, and you know, what's the role for energy information systems? You know, do we want to just go heavy and hard into those, or do we want to rely more on the, you know, the current kind of system that we have? I think that's where the conversation, you know, needs to continue. So I'll leave it at that.
Since Ben went long, I'll defer back to you, Don. I'll pass.
All right, I'll speak for David here. Just kidding. But I just want to thank our panelists and specifically echo a couple of the points that I heard today that I think are really critical. One, I think, is around sort of the role of new technology in this changing customer world. I mean, why are we even up here talking about on-grid, off-grid, what the role of the customer is? It is because the world is changing incredibly quickly. We were not having this conversation 5 years ago, and that's not as a result of things that we in this room decided. It's a result of what's happening in the world and how quickly technology is changing. So many of these points are about how we adapt and become really proactive in creating the pieces of the future that we want, while understanding that much of this future is coming to us, whether we like it or not. And it's about how we engage, how we work together, and how we collaborate to make sure that has a broad benefit for many of us here. So with that, I'd like to thank our fantastic panelists on customer choice, and hope you will join me in thanking them as well.